It begins with a realization that feels almost unsettling in its simplicity. Human civilization did not begin once, and it did not move forward in a straight line. It rose, paused, fractured, and reassembled many times across the world, often in places that later generations would never recognize as ancient centers of complexity. What we call civilization today is not an invention, but an inheritance built upon layers so compressed by time that their existence was nearly forgotten. Long before writing, before kings, before borders, people were already organizing landscapes, managing resources, and passing knowledge across generations. Archaeology reveals this quietly, not through dramatic collapse, but through repetition. Beneath cities across the globe lie older cities. Beneath temples, older foundations. Beneath roads, earlier pathways. Each layer represents a complete human world that once believed itself permanent. In Africa, where modern humans first emerged, the roots of civilization stretch far deeper than stone monuments. Genetic evidence confirms that populations across the continent maintained deep continuity while developing complex social systems tens of thousands of years ago. Long-distance exchange networks existed in eastern and southern Africa well before agriculture, connecting communities through shared materials and cultural practices. These were not isolated bands, but structured societies whose knowledge moved with people, preserved in both memory and DNA. As humans spread outward from Africa, they carried more than tools. Ancient DNA shows that migrating groups did not simply replace one another. Instead, they mixed, adapted, and settled, forming regional populations that endured for millennia. In the Near East, some of the earliest sedentary communities emerged after the last ice age. Villages formed around reliable water sources, long before formal states existed. These early societies developed architecture, ritual spaces, and food storage systems that allowed population stability without centralized authority. At sites across the Fertile Crescent, layers of occupation reveal repeated cycles of settlement and abandonment. Climate shifts altered rainfall patterns, rivers changed course, and social systems reorganized. Yet ancient DNA extracted from human remains shows continuity through these transitions. The people did not disappear when a village declined. They moved, regrouped, and built again, often nearby, carrying forward their biological lineage even as their material culture changed. This pattern is not limited to one region. In South Asia, the Indus Valley civilization emerged with planned cities, standardized measurements, and extensive trade networks. When these urban centers declined, likely due to environmental stress rather than invasion, DNA evidence suggests population continuity rather than disappearance. Descendant communities remained, adapting to new ecological conditions while maintaining deep ancestral roots that persist in the region today. In East Asia, early agricultural societies formed along river systems such as the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. Archaeological layers show long sequences of development, interruption, and renewal. Ancient DNA studies reveal that these regions experience gradual population shifts, not abrupt replacements. Farming expanded through cultural transmission and local adaptation, while core populations endured through centuries of change. Even in regions once thought peripheral, the same pattern appears. In the Americas, complex societies developed independently, shaped by local environments and long-term population stability. From the Andean highlands to Mesoamerica, ancient DNA reveals that many communities maintained genetic continuity across major cultural transitions. Cities rose, political systems changed, but people remained connected to their ancestors through uninterrupted lineages. Australia presents an even deeper example. Aboriginal populations represent one of the longest continuous human presences on Earth. Archaeology and genetics confirm tens of thousands of years of continuity, despite dramatic environmental changes. Social systems adapted without agriculture or urbanization, demonstrating that civilization is not a single model, but a spectrum of sustainable human organization. For much of modern history, these early layers were underestimated or misunderstood. Early archaeological interpretation favored monumental architecture and written records, unintentionally overlooking societies that left subtler traces. Yet DNA does not privilege monuments. It preserves continuity equally, whether people lived in cities or seasonal camps. Genetic evidence has become one of the most powerful tools for revealing how deeply rooted many populations truly are. Across continents, ancient DNA studies repeatedly challenged the idea of total collapse. When societies failed, it was rarely the people who vanished. Instead, political structures dissolved, trade networks weakened, and cultural expressions shifted. Families persisted, communities adapted, knowledge survived in fragments, passed quietly from generation to generation. This is where the idea of multiple civilizations becomes meaningful, not as a count of empires, but as a recognition of cycles. Each civilization believed itself new, standing at the edge of history, unaware that it was built upon others whose names were lost. Their foundations were reused, their fields replanted, their descendants lived on, often without knowing how ancient their inheritance truly was. Ancient DNA confirms this layered reality. Genetic lineages pass through cultural boundaries that once seemed absolute. They cross from pre-agricultural societies into farming communities, from village life into urban centers, from empire into fragmentation. Civilization changes its form, but humanity remains continuous. GenealogyX follows this evidence where archaeology and genetics intersect. The story that emerges is not one of disappearance, but of compression. History stacks itself. Time presses human experience into layers that can only be separated with care. When we uncover them, we find not lost civilizations, but familiar ones, lived by people not so different from ourselves. The foundations of our world are far older and far more global than traditional history once allowed. Civilization did not rise once in one place. It rose many times, across many landscapes, carried forward by people whose genetic DNA still connects us to those earliest builders. And beneath every modern city, every nation, every identity, those layers remain, quiet, compressed, waiting to be recognized. As human societies moved deeper into the Bronze Age, something subtle but profound occurred across the world. Technology accelerated, trade expanded, and social hierarchies became more visible. Yet beneath these changes, ancient DNA reveals a quieter truth. Most populations were not replaced, they endured. Civilizations shifted shape, but the people themselves remained remarkably continuous. In the Eastern Mediterranean, complex societies rose and fell in cycles that once appeared catastrophic. Archaeology recorded burned cities, abandoned palaces, and sudden changes in material culture. For generations, these moments were described as collapses, invasions, or population replacements. Ancient DNA now tells a different story. Genetic continuity persists through these disruptions, showing that while elites fell and political systems fractured, local populations adapted and carried on. This pattern repeats in Mesopotamia, where empires rose from the same river valleys repeatedly. Sumerian cities gave way to Akkadian power, which fragmented and reassembled under new names. DNA extracted from remains across these periods shows deep regional continuity. The people who lived under different rulers were often descendants of the same ancestral communities, separated more by administration than by biology. In Europe, Bronze Age migrations introduced new ancestry, particularly from steppe populations, but this was not erasure. Genome-wide studies demonstrate that these migrations layered onto existing populations rather than replacing them. Over centuries, local hunter-gatherer, early farmer, and steppe ancestries blended into stable regional profiles. By the Iron Age, most of Europe already carried the genetic foundations still present today. In East Asia, early states formed along river systems, rose to power, fragmented, and reformed under new names. Dynasties changed names and borders, but DNA shows long-term population stability in many regions. Agricultural expansion occurred largely through cultural transmission rather than mass population replacement. People adopted new technologies while remaining biologically continuous with earlier inhabitants. Across the Indian subcontinent, the genetic record reflects deep time rather than sudden disruption. Urban centers declined, political systems changed, but populations persisted. Ancient DNA reveals complex layering of ancestry, reflecting migration and interaction over thousands of years, yet always rooted in local continuity. Civilization reorganized, but the human presence never vanished. In the Americas, societies developed independently, shaped by geography and environment. When cities like Teotihuacan declined or political systems fractured, ancient DNA shows that local populations remained. Descendant communities adapted to new social arrangements while maintaining biological continuity that stretches back thousands of years. Collapse here, too, meant transformation, not disappearance. Even the fall of the Western Roman Empire follows this pattern. Once described as a catastrophic demographic catastrophe, genetic studies now reveal continuity across Roman and post-Roman populations in many regions. While military and political structures dissolved, local communities persisted. Roman identity faded, but Roman people remained, absorbed into new cultural frameworks. Time and again, ancient DNA challenges the idea that civilization ends when empires fall. Instead, it reveals a process of compression. Knowledge fragments, power decentralizes, cities shrink or move, but families remain, lineages endure. Civilization sleeps rather than dies. This perspective reshapes how we understand progress. Each era believed itself advanced, standing apart from what came before. Yet genetic evidence shows that most societies inherited far more than they realized. Irrigation techniques, agricultural knowledge, social organization, and even dietary adaptations were passed forward through people themselves, not just through texts or monuments. By the medieval period, much of the world was already biologically modern. Large-scale population movements became rarer and regional genetic structures stabilized. What changed most rapidly were belief systems, technologies, and political identities. DNA continued its slow, steady transmission, unaffected by borders or ideologies. Modern genetic studies now allow us to trace this continuity with extraordinary clarity. Genome sequencing reveals how ancient populations persist within modern ones, sometimes in regions that appear culturally transformed. DNA does not remember empires, it remembers people. This brings us to the meaning of the phrase, the seventh civilization. Not as a literal count, but as a lens. Civilization is not a single ascent. It is a sequence of reorganizations built upon surviving populations. Each layer inherits the biological legacy of those beneath it, even when cultural memory is lost. We are not the first to believe we live in unprecedented times. Ancient societies believe the same. They built monuments meant to last forever. They recorded histories that framed their world as new. Yet beneath their cities lay others they barely understood. And beneath those, more still. GenealogyX follows these patterns where archaeology and DNA intersect. The evidence does not point to lost golden ages or vanished superpowers. It points to endurance, to humans who adapted again and again, rebuilding social worlds while carrying their ancestry forward, quietly and persistently. Understanding this changes how we see ourselves. We are not disconnected from the deep past. We are its continuation. Our world is not separate from ancient ones. It is their latest expression. As night settles and the pace of history slows, this realization becomes gentle rather than overwhelming. Civilization is not fragile. It is resilient because people are resilient. It bends, reshapes, and compresses, but it does not disappear. Beneath our cities, beneath our languages, beneath our assumptions of novelty, lie layers of human experience still present within us. Not erased, not lost, simply buried beneath time. And as the evidence continues to surface, through soil, through bone, through DNA, we begin to see our place more clearly. Not as the beginning, not as the end, but as one layer among many, carrying forward a story far older than we ever imagined. If this deeper view of human history resonates with you, GenealogyX is where these long stories continue to unfold, because civilization does not vanish. It remembers, through us.